Hi, welcome. I'm Praveer, and today I'm going to share a practical approach to leveraging the powers within to build organizations of the future. There are several components to the building of such an organization. And first, I want to go over the concept of creating a flexible systems canvas, which can be used to envision and build such organizations. I'm going to go over the idea of managing change on the system canvas through the sophisticated internal device that all human beings are endowed with, that of emotional intelligence. I'm going to go with the idea of tapping into deeper possibilities through powers that exist within us. As we make change from one way of operating to another, the practical issue is one of keeping vital flows alive. And so I'll briefly discuss an approach to that. The complexity of the environment and the way things change unexpectedly requires a different way to arrive at deeper equilibrium, an equilibrium such that the person is more deeply in touch with the system around them. And for that, I'm going to suggest the calling of light. I'm also going to suggest as a way to bring about this practical approach to the future organization, a mathematical modeling of such future enterprise. And then finally, I will summarize by bringing it all together, all these various components together. So starting with the idea of developing a systems canvas. For this, I'd like to share this very insightful video on systems thinking. It's a YouTube video, and it's focused on how wolves change rivers.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years. But the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds and migratory birds started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. Here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed, more pools formed, more riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
Well, let's keep that in mind as we go forward with the rest of this presentation, because there are some remarkable aspects about how wolves change rivers that will be reflected in some of this content, and I'll make a point to call some of this out. So now the question is, what kind of system is most sustainable? And research has indicated that this would be a complex adaptive system. And we can think of this in terms of the complexity, which means that predictions cannot be made about what will emerge through interaction of parts. And this is, in a sense, the idea, if we go back to the wolf video, about the fact that they would alter the course of rivers is something that perhaps we would not be able to predict, but it happens because of the interaction of the different parts that existed in Yellowstone National Park. Adaptive is the idea that the system will change to overcome any challenge. And the system really is referring to that which contains many independent parts that operate as one entity. So a complex adaptive system has been found to be amongst the most resilient, sustainable of systems. And examples of this are cities. And so now the question is, what is it that drives the sustainability of complex adaptive systems? So one macro way to think about that is that there's two kinds of advantageous scalings that are happening as the size of the complex adaptive system increases. So if we think about or see size being on the horizontal axis and the scaling advantage being on the vertical axis, if the system was not a complex adaptive system, then there would be a linear relationship between these two parameters. So as the size of a city doubles, then essentially we would expect that the scaling advantage, so whether of economies of scale or whether of innovation, would remain purely linear. And that would mean that this system is not operating as a resilient system. If it is truly a complex adaptive system, there will be something called a sublinear advantage that kicks in. And one can think of it as economies of scale. So for instance, the number of grocery stores that would be required to service double the population would be less than double. And we can also think about the superlinear scaling, which means that as the population of a city doubles, the innovation would go up by more than twice. So therefore, it's a superlinear scale. And essentially, what drives the sustainability of complex adaptive systems is this differential, this implicit differential between the superlinear and the sublinear, which gives the advantage, uh, some kind of multiple beyond what happens at the linear scale. So when we think about a creative canvas based on complex adaptive systems properties, and we saw several of these properties implicit in the World Change Rivers video, but the idea, I'll just call out some of these: distributed control, that there is not a single entity that's in control, but there's many different entities that influence how things happen. So there's wolves, there's trees, there's the deer, there's other animals, there's beavers, and so on. There's connectivity between all the elements. There's certainly coevolution that takes place because everything evolves together in one direction or the other. There's sensitivity to initial conditions. So in the absence of the wolf being there, the system as a whole, Yellowstone National Park, was evolving in one way. But with the introduction of wolves, it began to evolve in another way. There's non-linearity because the introduction of a few wolves had tremendous and huge impact that was completely non-linear on the system as a whole. There's emergence, and here this is referring to something that cannot be predicted, that is a result of all the different interactions that take place. And in this case, it would be the fact that the rivers itself change course. Far from equilibrium refers to this notion that the system makes some of its most advantageous changes when it has moved away from an equilibrium that dictated how it operated in the past. There's apparent paradoxes that exist. And then, as I mentioned, there's unpredictability, and of course, there's multiple levels of organization at the plant level, animal level, at the level of rivers, and so on in the Yellowstone National Park example. But also what literature won't go over. So these are the typical bottom-up kinds of advantages or parameters we see in complex adaptive systems. But also there are top-down parameters that are prevalent in any complex adaptive system. So there's time and space patterns that come into being. So if we observe a resilient system over an extended period of time or over the space of its influence, we'll see certain patterns that emerge gradually. And these give us insight into implicit biases or implicit ways that the system itself is operating that may not be at all predicted by any of its parts that influence how it operates from the bottom up. There's therefore altered causality because once we see these different kinds of trends come into being, then we have insight into how the system tends to operate as an entity when considered at system level. And there's other additional properties that come into being. Now, the creative canvas that I've geared or veered towards is a combination of both these bottom-up and top-down properties. And I've written a series of books that have to do with fractals. So you'll see over here 4 books that are part of a fractal series. And there's the first book that was just the pure theoretical basis of how patterns of perceptions, assumptions, behaviors by a small entity can influence the dynamics in larger and larger entities. And the second book was an application of that to the global financial crisis of 2008. There was a third book which looked at the essential time and space patterns and played those out in many different application areas to do with whether it was politics or social development, environmental development, economic development, and so on. And then there was a summary book, The Fractal Organization, which combined parts of the previous 3 and also had a separate part on a practical way to build a fractal organization. And finally, there was a new series of books based on cosmology of light, but there was a particular kind of mathematics that is summarized in the book called The Cosmology of Light, which is the sixth in the series of the Cosmology of Light books. And when taken in unison, these 5 books become a foundational way in which to observe or understand systems that operate on a different kind of canvas. After all, our ability to understand a system is going to be determined by the properties we implicitly prescribe to it based on some kind of observation. And to the degree that we can recognize that something different might happen, that gives us more power to make different things happen. And the canvas, in a sense, that I've geared towards has been essentially related to these series of books that I've written over the course of 20 plus years. So the system canvas essentially lays out this foundational way of thinking about systems. But then the question is, once we do have the system in view, then how do we manage disorganization that naturally occurs at every point in space and every instant of time? And there's a particular way to do that. But before we go into that, let's understand what drives disorganization from a macro scale in complex adaptive systems. So going back to this scaling model where we had the superlinear scaling and the sublinear scaling and the linear scaling as size varies and as the scaling advantage might or might not kick in. We know it's a complex adaptive system. Just to summarize, if there are the scaling advantages of the superlinear and sublinear that provide a multiple over the linear effect. But at the same time, if we think about superlinear scaling, there's the possibility of faster than linear or superlinear disorganization, because very often a group can become subject to groupthink or rely on past laurels, and then things can get disorganized much faster than in the case of linear scaling. And similarly, when we think about the sublinear advantage, there is disorganization that can occur as a repetition occurs between disconnected parts of the system. So for example, there'll be a high degree of fragmentation and waste as a result, and these need to be closely managed. So the way that I've promoted managing this through the last few decades is through emotional intelligence. And essentially, we can think about emotional intelligence as being a very sophisticated radar system that we are all naturally endowed with. And as a result of this radar system, we can become aware not only of signals that impact us, but we can begin to read signals that are occurring in our immediate environments or even in the market or the system beyond, if we develop that kind of sensitivity. Now, to develop the sensitivity and to manage the system at the margin where the change is happening, I've developed a practical emotional intelligence tool. And this tool is essentially driven, so it primarily operates at the team level in complex organizations. And we can say that individuals who belong to a team are provided complete anonymity. So we don't know their identity as they make entries into the system. The entries are emotionally based. So usually it's a feeling or a sensation that might drive an entry. So if somebody's feeling fear or frustration or joy, or is feeling a great amount of energy, they would enter that in and they would specify why. We have a wheel of emotions that is a model that's been used more universally. There's a number of reminders as to what potentially we could be feeling at any point in time. And these individual entries that then also require that the intensity of an emotion or a sensation we entered and the duration of it approximately, and the reason why it's occurring, are then trended together. And of course, when a team reviews these entries, again, it's the identity of who entered this remains anonymous, but there's some things that a team can do collectively to begin to manage the different kinds of issues that are driving emotions. So if we think about a work organization where it's subject to timelines and pressures of competing projects, then, for example, here in this first row, we see somebody experiencing anger due to timelines that are getting compressed. But then the team really gets together to ask how can these different issues that are causing different emotions be addressed, and the team can collectively come up with various solutions, decide who's empowered to solve it, and that provides a different tool of empowerment for the team as a whole. The idea being that if the team is empowered to solve issues that occur at the individual level, then over time the individual should begin to feel more and more positive, and the kinds of emotions that are entered should change in their nature. After all, if we see anger persisting for a few weeks or fear persisting for a few weeks, we know that collectively there's the system that is not allowing, or there's a system change that's not happening that needs to happen. And so that's what's being pointed out by this kind of automatic tool. So this tool essentially creates a real-time mirror for the team or the organization so that various kinds of insights can be gained into the nature of the dynamics that are being experienced in the organization that's part of some system. So for example, here, suppose there's been 100 data points that have been entered in over, say, a period of 2 to 3 weeks. Then what the software does is it begins to trend it. So it takes the first half of the data, compares it to the second half. This is the zero line. So we know that the first half of the data was generally negative. The second half is generally positive. So the team overall is trending in the right direction, and that's what you want to see. But then the software breaks it up by body, by heart, gut, and by mind, based on the kinds of emotions that were entered. So we get a good sense or feel for how the team is changing by just looking at this snapshot of the trends. But then there's other kinds of metrics that are automatically calculated every time an entry is made. And just to draw out a couple, there's something called the collective dynamic score, which will tell the ability of the team to change negative to positive emotion. So essentially to change patterns that are negative to patterns that become positive. Every organization is usually driven by a set of core values that are particular to that organization. And so the software looks at the microblogs that are being entered in at the time of the emotional entry and scans them for certain words that are related to core values particular to that organizational system, and comes up with a score of to what degree that team or the organization are effectively using the core values that are meant to be part of its culture. There's a summary metric. I'm not going to go over all these metrics, but there's something called entropy, or the level of disorganization, that is a key metric in understanding any system. And we want to see entropy being low in general. Now, the theory is that entropy will naturally increase, and that idea is taken from physics. But the way to reverse that is to make sure there's some kind of intervention or injection of new energy. In the absence of interventions or the injection of new energies or new sources of inspiration, then we can say that the entropy of a team or an organization is going to tend towards becoming completely disorganized. And so these metrics provide insight, real-time insight into some of what's happening in the organization. In addition, there's, based on the metrics and the idea that we want to move the metrics from a red zone to a green zone, There's customized guidance that will be provided to help a team to move from red to green. And then there's, if we look at the periphery over here, there's, in this environment, there's 30 different teams. And we can see basically that we want the entropy to be within this green zone, but in reality, the entropy for most teams is way outside the green zone. And that's a non-ideal situation. It's also telling us how this organization is responding to the system and the fact that really it's not managing at the margin well at all. And as a result of that, it's going to get out of sync with the needs or the requirements of the system that, as I mentioned before, there's a particular time and space patterns that the system will want to move towards because that's going to assure its resilience. And if this particular organization cannot become a vehicle for that change to occur in the system, then it's going to be replaced by another organization that can help to propagate the system in the direction that it would like to move in. And so we have, in terms of a practical approach, now we have, just summarizing, the systems canvas that's created from both bottom-up and top-down properties. We have the idea of managing at the margin, and this is based on the sophisticated radar system that we are each endowed with. And it becomes our responsibility to make change such that the system can move in the direction that would assure its long-term resilience and adaptability. Now, moving to the third part, this is the idea of tapping into deeper possibilities through powers within. I'll introduce a short story here. I was working for an organization that was very interested in understanding the connection between culture and business value. And so if we look at the simulation that I had created on the top, there's a calculation of business value, and the bottom part shows the impact that culture can have on either growing this business value or in destroying it. But key to this value is something called the X factor, which tells us to what degree the culture itself is going to be able to successfully grow business value or destroy it. And so when we think about the X factor, what it really drives at is this fourfold architecture that's implicit at multiple scale. So when we look at the smallest measurable things that we can measure at the quantum level to the larger things that from a scale wise are halfway between the smallest and the largest things in the universe, this kind of settles on the cellular or human level. We find that there is the same kind of organization that animates all these different levels. So to give a concrete example, if we think about cells, the stability and resilience of cells requires the strong interaction of four independent molecular plans. These plans are called nucleic acids, proteins, polysaccharides, and lipids. And we know that any healthy cell has to have all four of these and has to have all four of these interacting in a particular way. And if we think about what's behind these molecular plans, nucleic acids, we know, drive the creation of DNA, therefore of the knowledge and the library of the cell, how all the components will act is embedded in this library. And so nucleic acids becomes, from this point of view, a carrier of a principle of knowledge. When we think about proteins, we have in a human cell over 30,000 different proteins, and these are workhorse elements. And so they provide a certain service to the cell or a presence to the cell, and therefore we can say that they are a carrier of a property organization principle of presence or service. Polysaccharides are sugars and are a carrier for a principle of power or energy. And lipids tend to create natural compartments in cells. And so we can say that it's a carrier for this principle of harmony. Now we find, interestingly, the same kind of architecture animating atoms in the periodic table, animating quantum particles at the quantum level, animating the very field level from which everything else emanates or emerges. So in the electromagnetic spectrum, we can find the same four principles active. And one of the corollaries of this is that there's something implicit in or hidden by the quantum level that from which we can say the field level and everything else emerges. And here the quantum level is referring to quantum particles, but there's a quantum level that is antecedent to the field level. And we can say that in that level or in that antecedent layer, these four properties, perhaps are united as one. And there's that act of being united means that there's a property of love that binds them. As they become explicit and begin to organize the field level, the quantum particle level, the atomic level, and cellular level, these four are still required to operate as one. So what's implicit becomes explicit, and therefore we see the very basis of love itself that is animating this fourfold architecture. The point here, of course, is that there's a fourfold architecture that is bound together by this invisible factor of love and has to continue to be bound together for organizations or systems to continue to operate in a healthy way. At the same time, as we look at the diversification of these four principles, we see clearly that at the cellular level, as opposed to, say, the quantum particle level, the meaning of these four principles, essentially knowledge, presence, power, harmony, gets immensely diversified. So as I pointed out, you have over 30,000 different proteins or presence elements in the cell, as opposed to a handful when you push it back to the quantum particle level. Interestingly, in a study done by Fortune in 2015 of those companies that were most respected for their culture and yet were able to maintain economic value on a sustained basis, there were some examples here of Build-A-Bear, Zappos, Whole Foods Market. And if you study or look at the values that drive the culture of those organizations, you'll see that, in fact, they can be distributed by knowledge, presence, power, and harmony as well, which again goes to show that there's this fourfoldness that is driving a kind of advantage for organizations that are able to tap into or maintain that as a core basis of how they are organized. The four values also can become the basis of a new kind of lens by which to see opportunity. And here there's the idea of leveraging neuroplasticity by introducing people and organizations to a different kind of language that gets sensitive or attuned to the creation of this new lens. And in particular, if we look at the kind of language I'm speaking about, there's, for example, phrases like the study of life in areas outside the domain of my work, the urge to protect others, the readiness to follow any needful self-discipline in the aim of service. But that's not normal language that's used in work environments. And for those interested, in fact, these phrases are derived from some insights that Sri Aurobindo has written about in several of his books, including a book called The Mother and another book called The Synthesis of Yoga, for instance. But the idea of building a new lens that will change the neuroplasticity of individuals is based on getting introduced to this different kind of language that then awakens one to different kinds of instincts that drive fourfoldness, and therefore one can create particular kinds of lenses by which different powers, deep powers, can begin to surface within individuals in a new and different kind of way. So I also created software that allows these instincts to be understood and developed more consciously at the individual and the team level. And the kinds of things that can become apparent through the use of this software is the bias or preponderance towards a particular power that might exist in an organization or part of the organization. So in this particular case, we see that there's a strong bias to knowledge, some to power, but very, very slight to service and nothing at all to harmony. And so this tells us something about the organization in terms of what it will be ready for or what it might be destabilized by if the environment or system changes in a particular kind of way. The fourfoldness also provides a map to understand organizational positioning. And here, for example, we see research and development that clearly should be higher in knowledge and wisdom, but also have strength and service perfection. And similarly, there's organizations that can all be thought of, or departments that can all be thought of in terms of these four deep qualities or properties that exist, as we saw, not only at the electromagnetic level, but also at the quantum particle level, at the level of atoms, and the level of cells, and of course, successful organizations. But on the flip side, it also becomes a means by which particular strength can be developed in organizations, gaps can be understood. And if a organization needs to express itself in a particular way or go into a particular kind of market, then there's already a particular kind of DNA that would be required for it to prepare itself by in order to really be successful in that organization. So we see here the third element of this practical approach, which is creation based on powers within. Now, I'll briefly go over this idea of keeping vital flows alive by, again, thinking about system depiction in terms of this fourfoldness. And so here we can think about any kind of system as being a combination of different kinds of fourfoldness. And here I have an arbitrary arrangement of knowledge and power, service, mutuality, power positioning, relative power dynamics, harmony, knowledge, and perfection. And these, as I'll show in a minute, can be related to the makeup of a market. So if we translate this into a market understanding, then essentially we can say that knowledge and power is driving the source of revenues in terms of the merchandising, marketing, site design, and pricing mix of an organization. Similarly, there's service that is provided by a certain kind of product mix, and so on. So we can see that a market can be understood in terms of these four underlying dynamics and opportunities or different plays that are displayed can be seen by these red lines. So there might be particular combinations of these underlying four properties that are combined to offer something in the market. But we can also see that the market becomes or can become impossibly complex very, very quickly, as there are many, many different combinations that can come to the surface, and it becomes impossible to be able to succeed or to be able to keep vital flows alive unless one thinks about the market in terms of the system and begins to take initiatives based on the idea of emergence and experimentation that had been kind of projected as bottom-up properties at the beginning of this presentation. And so, for instance, here we can see that in this particular way to capture markets, there are arbitrary rules or experimental rules that are set up that combine things in particular ways. And this is set against another rule. And then due to data that's being gathered, we can make a determination as to which rule is more successful and then diversify that in order to keep vital flows alive. So the third or the fourth idea is that of leveraging theory of system to keep vital flows alive. And now we come to the fifth idea, which is calling light to arrive at deeper equilibrium. And here I'm going to go to the idea of light existing at different speeds. So we have, let's consider that light in its native state may exist in a reality of being at infinite speed. So if we consider that scenario, then light at infinite speed, if you think about a volume, however large it might be, then light's going to be instantaneously present everywhere. So there's going to be this property of omnipresence or presence. Since everything is connected in that fabric of light, then light's going to have a knowledge of everything that appears or disappears in it instantaneously. So it'll have a property of omniscience or knowledge. Since everything is connected in the fabric of light, there's going to be an implicit property of harmony that exists. And since light is present everywhere, there's going to be this omnipresence that's going to exist. So there's four properties: presence, power, knowledge, and harmony that exist in that. And just to clarify, if anything not the nature of light arises, then light will overpower it, and that's where the fourth property of omnipotence or power comes from. Now, when light projects itself at a slower speed, then this fourfoldness maintains itself. And so if we think about light at 186,000 miles per second, then there's basically a symmetry of these four properties of presence, power, knowledge, harmony that will show up even in this restricted realm. So here, if we watch the sun rising from the earth, and we know that it takes 8.5 minutes for light from the sun to reach the earth. And if we just do a thought experiment and consider ourselves on a ray of light, then we know that if we're halfway on the journey, then the whole notion of time arises because of the way light is traveling, because the past, present, future are due to the speed of light. But also there's a fourth property, and that's that of matter, that also arises because light can only display what it's trying to after a certain amount of time or distance, which is related to the idea of quanta, which is the basis of all matter. So we see that past, present, future, and matter itself arise. But if we ask more deeply what past, present, future, and matter are, then past has a tremendous amount of presence embedded into it. The present moment has a tremendous amount of force or vitality embedded in it, because depending on what's strongest, that's what's going to show itself or dictate how perception takes place. There's an implicit way in which things are evolving, and so there's knowledge that discloses itself in the future, and so knowledge is related to the future. And then matter itself occurs in basically patterns of harmony, and so it points to an implicit harmony that exists. And so we see the same four properties regardless of how light is traveling. And this becomes important in this notion of applying light that I'm going to share in a minute. If we think about quanta, then we can think about these two realms of light, one where you have light traveling infinitely fast or creating a different kind of field, which informs the material field, which, as we just went over, is characterized by past, present, future, and matter. But quanta is a bridge mechanism that takes information from the invisible infinite field and manifests it materially in this finite material field. And so when we ask what's made up of light, then essentially we're saying that all emergences are made up of light. As you recall, when I went over the fourfold patterns, those four patterns itself were the idea of knowledge, presence, power, and harmony. And we said that they exist at cells, they exist in the atoms, they exist in quantum particles. And therefore, when we extrapolate, we can say that everything is in fact made up of light. So that's a fundamental basis for now going into these two kinds of thought visualizations or these practical exercises that I've experimented a lot with organizations. There's been hundreds of workshops that have been had at some organizations, and there's been in fact, a Forbes organizational sciences certification program in which light was a key element of it. But essentially, the idea being that there is a personal light sphere that, because we're all deeply endowed with light, as I just went over, because light makes up quantum particles, makes up atoms, makes up cells, the very substance of what we are. So there's a light sphere that exists with us, and it's possible to envision this light sphere, to move it, to put different things into it, to allow light to act on different things and change the dynamics of how that thing is going to evolve. There's also dual vision due to this idea of seeing things as we do with our physical eyes, and then seeing things with our mind's eye due to a different kind of operational dynamic we have access to by light in its native field. Nature of light is one. And essentially, when we enter into light, then we can, at least at the level of mind, create these experiments in dual vision to begin to see the same thing differently. And so this essentially gives us access to extending possibilities and managing impossibilities with light. So a very difficult interpersonal dynamic or team situation or a quandary in the marketplace, if light is allowed to engulf it through a sincere application, then perhaps some of the dynamics might change, but not in a way that you might expect, but in a way that makes sense for light in the basis of its own operation. So that's the fifth practical approach. And then the sixth idea is that of actually creating a mathematics to actualize future organizations. So if we think about space as being the playing field within which we exist, and time as being or displaying certain maturity in how things evolve in space, then there's a mathematical model that one can use. And we can see that there's, at the base of this model, as I just went over, there's presence, power, knowledge, harmony. And these exist in a couple of different ways. We went over the idealized space where light exists infinitely fast. And then we went over a more material space where it exists as past, present, future, and matter. And there's a number of intermediate layers. But essentially, what's being pointed to here is that there's multiple sources of innovation. So to the degree that we can activate deeper light within us, there's a different source of innovation that can become active and change the way things will emerge in time. And also, this helps us to distinguish between different types of complex adaptive systems, because we have the complex adaptive system that, for example, we saw in Yellowstone National Park, that has important elements of mind emerging in the mind of the wolves and the animals. But that's nothing compared to what emerges in human beings. And there's what this is really pointing to. This is saying that there's different sources of innovation that essentially get turned on at different sequences or different points in time. And with the emergence of the human being, the natural flow from the deepest layer to the surface layer is not natural anymore, because the human being has to work in order for that flow to get reactivated. There is, in fact, a natural trend towards entropy, as I pointed out, of disorganization in the absence of a new injection of energy or a new source of inspiration. And there's a particular bias or way in which human beings operate in systems that lock it into this surface layer, and there's work to be done to actually create the future organization by going to deeper levels of innovation. Therefore, we can see that there's a cohesive mathematics that drives the actualization of future organizations. And this mathematics then would drive all the different tools that I've introduced here, the simulation, the emotional intelligence tool, the powers within, and light itself can be seen as applications of allowing a different kind of math to get embedded in the organization. So we have this sixth point, which is essentially then the mathematical modeling of useful tools that can propagate or expedite the appearance or creation of that future kind of organization that is truly resilient, that's truly driven by deeper powers within, that is flexible to this canvas of system properties that not only have bottom up but top down properties as well, and further that organization in which things can be managed at the margin to move towards resilience due to the sophisticated radar system that we're endowed with, that becomes even more sophisticated as we use it more. So bringing this together and summarizing creation of the future enterprise, I've in fact written about all these elements on 2 series of complex systems articles in Forbes. There's about 15 to 18 articles that I've written over the course of 3 years to try and capture all these different elements, so that becomes a source for anybody to tap into. And to just summarize, the source of what's possible in a system is going to be based on the canvas that one attributes to the system. And in my case, it's been these series of books. This allows a particular traversing of the system so that it becomes then something is more plastic, that's more amenable to deeper possibilities, and can shift in a direction that makes it much more sustainable and resilient to light itself. And summarizing, we have this 6-part operation or dynamics that will animate the future organization that I have just gone over in this presentation. Thank you.